A homeless Navy SEAL dug one last well, but when his loyal dog uncovered a golden bull, powerful men came for everything. Ethan Cross had nothing left but a forgotten ranch, an old military dog named Ranger, and a promise to a fallen friend. He wasn't searching for treasure, only water. But beneath the cracked Texas earth, Ranger uncovered a secret buried for centuries, one powerful enough to save a dying valley or destroy the last thing Ethan had left. Comment 1 if you'd keep digging, or 0 if you would have walked away, and tell us where you're watching from. The wind arrived before the sunrise. It slipped through the broken boards of the abandoned bunkhouse with a dry whistle that sounded almost human, stirring dust that had settled over decades of forgotten seasons. The old building stood alone on the edge of a ranch that once fed generations of cattle, but now looked more like the surface of another planet. Every pasture had turned the color of old leather. Mesquite trees leaned under years of relentless drought. Fence posts tilted toward the earth, as though they had finally grown tired of standing. Inside the bunkhouse, Ethan Cross opened his eyes before dawn. He did not wake because he was rested. He woke because sleep had become a place where ghosts waited. For a few long seconds, he stared at the warped wooden ceiling without moving. His breathing was shallow. His hand instinctively searched for a rifle that no longer lay beside him. Instead, his fingers touched an old wool blanket, worn smooth after years of use. A quiet weight rested against the side of the bed. Ranger. The aging German shepherd raised his head the moment Ethan inhaled sharply. The dog did not bark. He simply watched. Gray now surrounded the once black muzzle that had accompanied Ethan through deserts, mountain villages, and countless patrols overseas. One ear carried an old scar where flying debris had torn through it years ago. His amber eyes remained alert, patient, and impossibly calm. "You already know," Ethan whispered. Ranger's tail brushed once against the floor. That was enough. Ethan slowly sat up, rubbing the stiffness from his shoulders. At 47, his body carried more miles than most men twice his age. Old injuries greeted him every morning before he even placed his boots on the floor. His left knee protested. His lower back tightened. The scar beneath his ribs burned whenever cold mornings arrived. But none of those wounds hurt as much as the ones no one could see. Some mornings he still smelled smoke that wasn't there. Some mornings he heard helicopters that existed only inside his memories. Some mornings he remembered names he had spent years trying not to remember. Today was one of those mornings. He closed his eyes. Just breathe. 4 seconds in. Hold. 4 seconds out. The breathing exercise had been taught by a military counselor years ago. Sometimes it worked. Sometimes it didn't. Today, Ranger quietly rested his head on Ethan's knee before the panic could fully arrive. The simple touch grounded him. "I'm okay," Ethan lied. Ranger remained exactly where he was. The small propane stove coughed twice before producing a weak blue flame. Ethan boiled the last of yesterday's coffee grounds. It tasted bitter enough to make him smile. He poured half into a cracked enamel cup. The other half cooled inside a metal bowl. Ranger drank first. That had become their routine long ago. The man who once led dangerous operations across hostile territory now counted every cup of water before deciding how much either of them could spare. Outside, the first light spread slowly across the Texas hill country. It should have been beautiful. Instead, it revealed damage. Cracks split the ground in every direction. The cattle pond had become a bowl of dry clay. Even the windmill had stopped turning months earlier. Its rusted blades pointed toward an empty sky that had forgotten how to rain. Ethan stepped onto the porch. The ranch stretched for hundreds of acres. It was silent. Too silent. Years ago, there had been cattle, children laughing during branding season, pickup trucks coming and going, neighbors helping neighbors. Now the nearest occupied ranch sat several miles away. The drought had emptied more than reservoirs. It had emptied lives. Ranger walked beside him as they followed the familiar dirt path toward the main house. The white farmhouse had once belonged to Eleanor Brooks. She had been the widow of Ethan's closest friend. Master Chief Daniel Brooks. Ethan still remembered the day the casualty officers knocked on Eleanor's door. He remembered standing beside her without saying a word because there were no words capable of surviving that moment. Years later, after illness finally caught Eleanor herself, she had left Ethan something no one else wanted. The ranch. Not because it was valuable anymore, because it wasn't. The paperwork had surprised everyone, including Ethan. When he visited her one final time in hospice care, she had barely possessed enough strength to speak. Yet she reached for his hand. "You promised Daniel," she whispered. He leaned closer. "I know. He loved this place. I know. Don't let it die." Her fingers tightened with surprising strength. "Even if you have to fight alone." Those had been her final, complete words. Ethan had repeated that promise to himself almost every day since. He walked toward the old barn. Inside hung faded photographs coated with dust. One showed Daniel Brooks standing beside Ethan after completing BUD/S training. Both looked impossibly young, both smiling, both believing they had all the time in the world. Ethan touched the corner of the frame. "You should have been here," he murmured. His voice disappeared into the empty building. The bank certainly wasn't waiting for memories. A folded notice rested inside the mailbox nailed to the fence. He already knew what it said before opening it. Final notice. Outstanding taxes. Foreclosure proceedings. Failure to respond would result in legal action. He folded the paper carefully. Not because he respected it. Because he had nothing else left to fold. The ranch couldn't produce enough income to pay taxes. There was no water. Without water, there was no cattle. Without cattle, there was no future. A pickup truck approached slowly along the gravel road. Luis Herrera climbed out before the dust had completely settled. Luis owned the neighboring ranch, or what remained of it. He removed his hat. "You hear about the McCall place?" Ethan nodded. "They left yesterday." Luis looked toward the horizon. "Fifth family this month." Neither man spoke for a while. Silence often carried more truth than conversation. "I've got enough feed for another week," Luis finally said. "If Ranger needs anything," Ethan smiled faintly, "he'd rather steal your beef jerky." Luis laughed once. "That's true." The smile disappeared almost immediately. "They're saying this drought isn't ending." "I've heard." "You ever think about walking away?" Ethan looked across the land. The answer should have been easy. No house, no money, no family waiting somewhere else. Just an abandoned ranch and an old military dog. Still, No. Louise studied him for a moment. Daniel would have said the same thing. He climbed back into his truck. Take care of yourself. You too. The dust settled again. By afternoon, the Texas sun had turned brutal. Heat shimmered across every field. Even insects seemed unwilling to move. Ethan spent hours repairing broken fence sections that no cattle remained to test. Work helped. When his hands stayed busy, his mind became quieter. Near sunset, Ranger wandered away. Nothing unusual. The dog often patrolled the property on his own. But after nearly 20 minutes, Ethan noticed he hadn't returned. He whistled once. No answer. Twice. Still nothing. He followed faint paw prints toward the western pasture. The old pecan tree stood alone there. It was one of the oldest trees on the property. Most of its leaves had fallen months early because of the drought. Its enormous branches cast only a small patch of shade now. Ranger sat beneath it. Perfectly still. His nose pointed toward the cracked earth. Eating pecans? Ethan joked. The dog didn't move. Instead, he pawed gently at one particular spot, then looked directly at Ethan. What? Another scratch, then another. Ethan walked closer. The ground looked exactly like everywhere else. Dry. Hard. Lifeless. He nudged the dirt with the toe of his boot. Nothing. Come on. Ranger remained where he was. The old dog almost never ignored commands, yet this time he refused. He scratched the earth again, then sat, watching, waiting, as though trying to explain something words could never carry. The evening breeze returned. It carried the smell of dust. Old grass, sun-baked earth. Ethan looked around the empty valley. He thought about Eleanor, about Daniel, about every promise that still refused to leave him alone. Finally, he exhaled. You really think it's here? Ranger's ears lifted. That was answer enough. Ethan looked back toward the bunkhouse. There was one shovel, one pickaxe, a coil of rope, nothing more, no drilling equipment, no machinery, no crew, just one broken veteran, and the only partner who had never abandoned him. He rested his hand gently against Ranger's neck. One last try. The German shepherd stood immediately. The setting sun painted both of their shadows across the cracked ground beneath the old pecan tree. For the first time in many months, Ethan Cross felt something that almost resembled hope. Tomorrow they would begin digging. The thought stayed with him long after darkness settled over the Texas hill country. He and Ranger sat quietly on the bunkhouse porch, watching the last ribbon of orange disappear behind distant limestone ridges. The windmill stood motionless against the fading sky like an old soldier still standing at attention long after the battle had ended. Neither of them made a sound. There was nothing left to say. The stars emerged one by one, brighter than they appeared in any city. Once Ethan had loved nights like this. During deployments, a clear sky often meant visibility, opportunity, another mission completed safely. Now clear skies meant something else. Another day without rain. He looked toward the forgotten pecan tree. Even in the darkness, Ranger's attention drifted back to it. You really believe there's something there, don't you? The German shepherd lifted his ears, but kept his eyes fixed on the distant silhouette. Ethan sighed. I hope you're right. That night's sleep found him quickly. Peace did not. The dream began the same way it always did. A canyon. Dust. The sharp crack of gunfire echoing between stone walls. Daniel Brooks turning toward him. Then the explosion. Ethan shouted before he even realized he was asleep. His body jerked upright. His heart pounded violently against his ribs. For one terrifying moment, he wasn't inside the bunkhouse. He was back overseas, back where everything had changed forever. He reached blindly for a weapon that wasn't there. A warm weight pressed firmly against his chest. Ranger. The old dog leaned into him exactly as he had done dozens of times before. Slowly, patiently, without fear. Ethan's breathing gradually slowed. His shaking hands found the familiar rough fur around Ranger's neck. I'm home. His voice cracked. I'm home. The dog rested his muzzle beneath Ethan's hand until the nightmare faded into memory once again. Outside, coyotes called somewhere across the valley. Inside, silence slowly returned. Before dawn the next morning, Ethan packed everything they owned that might help. One shovel, one pickaxe, a rusted digging bar, 2 5-gallon buckets, 50 feet of old climbing rope, one canteen filled only halfway, a pair of worn leather gloves whose stitching had almost completely disappeared. He loaded everything into an old wheelbarrow that squealed loudly with every turn of its cracked tire. Ranger walked beside him. The eastern horizon glowed pale blue. Morning air carried a slight chill that would disappear within the hour. When they reached the pecan tree, Ethan stopped. The ground looked exactly as it had yesterday. Hard, cracked, merciless. If you're wrong, Ethan said quietly, we're going to waste the last strength we've got. Ranger simply sat beside the same patch of earth. Waiting. Ethan smiled despite himself. Guess that's settled. He drove the shovel into the ground. The blade bounced back with a dull metallic vibration through the handle. The earth was harder than concrete. By the 10th strike, sweat already covered his forehead. By the 20th, his shoulders burned. By the 50th, a hole barely 6 inches deep marked the beginning of what felt impossible. Ranger never wandered away. He watched every movement, every breath, every pause. Hours slipped by beneath the growing Texas heat. The sun climbed higher until shimmering waves floated above the fields. Dust coated Ethan's boots. His shirt clung to his back. His hands blistered despite the gloves. Still he dug, swing, lift, break, throw, again, again. Sometimes discipline wasn't loud. Sometimes it looked exactly like this. One man refusing to quit because quitting would mean breaking a promise. Near midday, Ethan finally sat beneath the tree. His canteen held less than half its water. He removed the cap. Without hesitation, he poured part of it into Ranger's battered metal bowl. The dog drank slowly. Only after Ranger finished did Ethan lift the canteen to his own lips. The water was warm. It tasted faintly of metal. It might as well have been gold. You always ate first overseas, too, Ethan said with a tired smile. Ranger looked at him. Guess some habits never change. A dusty pickup appeared on the distant ranch road. Margaret Doyle climbed out carrying a covered basket. She had taught history at the county school for nearly 40 years before retiring. Everyone in the valley knew Margaret. She knew every family, every birthday, every funeral. She approached carefully. I figured stubborn men forget breakfast. Ethan stood. You didn't have to do that. Oh, yes, I did. She handed him a cloth-covered plate. Fresh biscuits, homemade peach preserves, 2 slices of smoked ham. The smell alone reminded Ethan how long it had been since he'd eaten a real meal. Margaret looked toward the growing hole. How deep? Maybe 2 feet. She nodded thoughtfully. You planning to reach China? Ethan laughed softly. Just water. Her smile faded. I remember when this ranch had 3 flowing wells. So do I. My father used to say, water always remembers where it belongs. Ethan glanced toward the dry pasture. I hope he was right. Margaret noticed Ranger standing over the excavation. He's guarding it. He picked the spot. She raised an eyebrow. The dog did? He wouldn't leave it. Margaret looked at Ranger for a long moment. I've learned something after 73 years. What's that? When old dogs become certain about something. She smiled. I pay attention. Before leaving, she quietly placed another gallon jug beside the tree. For both of you. Ethan thanked her. After she drove away, Ranger nudged the water jug toward Ethan. No. Ethan laughed. We'll both drink. The afternoon became brutal. Heat wrapped around the valley like an invisible blanket. Every swing of the pickaxe demanded more effort. The hole slowly widened. 3 feet, then 4. By sunset, it measured nearly 5 feet deep. Not enough. Nowhere near enough. Ethan climbed out, breathing heavily. His hands trembled from exhaustion. Ranger immediately walked to the edge and looked down. What? The dog barked once, a short, sharp warning, then stepped backward. Almost immediately, a section of loose dirt slid into the bottom of the hole. Ethan stared. If I'd still been down there. He looked at Ranger. You knew. The German shepherd simply wagged his tail once. Later that evening, Ethan reinforced the walls with old scrap lumber scavenged from a collapsed fence. Every board mattered, every precaution mattered. Experience had taught him that confidence killed faster than caution. For the next several days, the routine never changed. Wake before sunrise, fight through another nightmare, walk to the pecan tree, dig until exhaustion. Return after dark. The hole grew steadily deeper. 6 feet, 8. 10. The valley watched quietly. Some shook their heads. Some admired his determination. Others whispered that the homeless veteran had finally lost his mind. One afternoon, Luis Herrera stopped by carrying a sack of ice. You know folks in town are taking bets. Ethan smiled. About what? Whether you'll hit water, Luis shrugged, or bury yourself. Ethan laughed harder than he had in months. Which side did you bet on? I bet on Ranger. Ethan looked surprised. The dog? Luis nodded. That animal's seen things most people never will. He scratched Ranger gently behind the ears. If he says dig here, Luis looked toward the growing shaft. I'd keep digging. That night, Ethan measured the depth again. Nearly 12 feet. Still nothing but dry limestone and stubborn clay. His muscles screamed. Every breath hurt. His nightmares returned stronger because the narrow shaft reminded his mind of collapsed buildings and underground bunkers from long ago. Sometimes, climbing back out, he had to stop halfway up the ladder because panic squeezed his chest so tightly he couldn't breathe. Each time it happened, Ranger was waiting above, watching, never leaving, never letting Ethan face the darkness alone. On the 7th morning, Ethan climbed down carrying only his flashlight and pickaxe. The air below felt cooler, quieter, almost unnaturally still. He swung the pickaxe into the compacted earth. Once, twice, 3 times. Above him, Ranger suddenly stood. His ears snapped forward. His entire body became rigid. A low growl escaped his throat. Not at danger he could see. At something, deep beneath the ground. Ethan froze at the bottom of the narrow shaft. For a heartbeat, the world became perfectly still. Above him, Ranger's low growl rolled across the opening like distant thunder. It was not the warning bark he used for strangers. It was quieter than that, more focused. It was the sound he had made years ago before hidden danger revealed itself. Ethan slowly lowered the pickaxe. "What is it, partner?" Ranger paced around the edge of the well, ears standing high, nose working constantly. He looked down at Ethan, then toward the western side of the shaft. Again, then back at Ethan. The message was unmistakable. Not here. There. Ethan understood Ranger's signals better than most conversations. They had spent years communicating without words. He climbed carefully back to the surface, every movement deliberate. The walls were already showing small cracks from days of excavation. One careless step could send hundreds of pounds of dry earth collapsing inward. When he reached the top, Ranger immediately walked to a point roughly 6 feet away from the center of the shaft. He scratched the ground once, stopped, looked at Ethan, then scratched again. Ethan frowned. "We've already dug 12 feet. Ranger remained planted. "You want me to move the whole operation?" The old German shepherd never took his eyes off him. Ethan studied the ground. To him, it looked exactly like every other patch of dry Texas soil. But Ranger wasn't guessing. Military working dogs didn't guess. They noticed details humans overlooked. Tiny differences in scent. Moisture trapped deep underground. The movement of air through hidden spaces. Things invisible to ordinary eyes. Ethan slowly nodded. All right. He filled the existing shaft as safely as he could with loose dirt and marked it with wooden stakes before dragging every tool 6 feet west. The new location looked no different. Still, if Ranger trusted it, so did he. The first several hours produced nothing except more blistered hands. The limestone here felt denser, harder. Each swing echoed through the quiet valley. Clang, crunch, dust again, The afternoon sun burned overhead. Sweat soaked through Ethan's shirt until it clung to every scar across his back. His left shoulder, damaged during his final deployment, began to ache with every strike. He welcomed the pain. Physical pain was easier to understand. Late that afternoon, Margaret Doyle returned with fresh lemonade and sandwiches. She stopped beside the abandoned first shaft. "You moved." Ethan wiped his forehead. "Ranger wanted me to." Margaret looked at the dog. "He still hasn't left your side. Not once." She watched Ranger standing silently beside the new excavation. "I've read enough history to know people ignored animals far too often." Ethan smiled faintly. "I stopped making that mistake years ago." Margaret handed him the food. "You'll need your strength." Before leaving, she glanced toward the pecan tree. "My grandfather believed this tree was older than Texas itself." Ethan laughed softly. "I think he exaggerated. He usually did." Her expression became thoughtful. "But he always said this tree survived because its roots found something no one else could." She paused. "I never knew what he meant." Neither of them thought much about the comment. Not yet. By sunset, the second shaft had already reached nearly 6 feet. The soil had changed. Instead of loose clay, Ethan now encountered compacted layers mixed with pale limestone. The air inside the hole felt strangely cooler, almost damp. He pressed one hand against the wall. Cold. Oddly cold. For the first time in years, hope felt slightly heavier than disappointment. That evening, after another restless night interrupted by memories of war, Ethan returned before sunrise. The work continued. Day after day. The shaft reached 8 feet, then 10, then 12. The deeper he went, the quieter everything became. The sounds of the wind disappeared. Birdsong faded. Only the scrape of metal against stone remained. Sometimes the silence itself became unsettling, as though the earth were listening. His PTSD made confined spaces increasingly difficult. Several times he had to stop climbing down the ladder because the narrowing walls reminded him of collapsed buildings overseas. His breathing accelerated. Sweat formed despite the cool air below. The walls seemed to close inward. He shut his eyes, count 1, 2, 3. Before panic could fully take hold, Ranger's face appeared above the opening. The old dog looked directly into his eyes. Steady. Calm. Present. The familiar sight anchored Ethan once more. "I'm all right." He wasn't sure whether he was reassuring Ranger or himself. The days blended together. Luis Herrera occasionally stopped by with bags of ice. Margaret continued bringing meals. Some neighbors simply drove past slowly, shaking their heads. Others quietly admired the veteran who refused to surrender. Word spread through nearby towns. The homeless seal is digging another dry well. Most assumed it would end the same way every other attempt had ended. Failure. On the morning of the 14th day, the sky filled with heavy gray clouds. Everyone looked upward. Rain. The entire valley paused. Even birds seemed to wait. Then the clouds drifted away without releasing a single drop. Hope vanished almost as quickly as it had appeared. Ethan watched them disappear. So close. Ranger nudged his hand. We keep going. Back inside the shaft, Ethan swung the pickaxe into a layer of unusually hard stone. The impact vibrated differently. Not louder, sharper. He struck again. Clang. He frowned. That wasn't limestone. He cleared away several inches of compacted soil. A smooth surface slowly appeared beneath the dirt. Gray. Flat. Unlike any natural rock surrounding it. He knelt closer. The object continued beyond the edges of his flashlight. One enormous slab, perfectly level. His heartbeat quickened. He brushed away more dirt with his gloves. Straight edges emerged. Someone had shaped this. Long ago. "Eleanor," he whispered. "What did you leave me?" He climbed out to grab a steel digging bar. Ranger became unusually restless. The dog circled the opening repeatedly, whining now, not barking, whining. The sound carried urgency. Ethan returned below and carefully wedged the steel bar beneath one corner of the buried slab. He pushed. Nothing. He adjusted the angle, pushed harder. A deep grinding sound echoed through the shaft, stone against stone. Dust trickled from the ceiling. Ranger barked once, loud, sharp. Ethan stopped immediately. The dust settled. Silence. He waited. Nothing else happened. Easy. He repositioned himself. One final effort. The slab shifted barely an inch. A sudden rush of cool air burst upward from the narrow opening beneath it. Ethan instinctively stepped backward. Cold. Far colder than the surrounding earth. Air, moving air. His pulse accelerated. Hidden spaces often breathed. Caves, tunnels, old mines. He leaned forward with the flashlight. The beam disappeared into darkness below. He couldn't see the bottom. Above him, Ranger barked frantically. Again. 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 "Easy," Ethan called. "I'm coming up." He turned toward the ladder. Then everything happened at once. A sharp crack exploded behind him. The wall of the shaft fractured from top to bottom. The sound echoed like rifle fire. Ethan looked up. The ladder twisted violently. Loose earth poured downward. No, the entire western wall gave way. Thousands of pounds of dirt and fractured limestone collapsed into the shaft. The ladder disappeared beneath the avalanche. The force threw Ethan backward. His flashlight flew from his hand. Darkness swallowed everything. Above ground, Ranger lunged toward the collapsing opening without hesitation. The earth beneath his paws crumbled. He dug desperately, barking with every breath, clawing through loose soil until blood appeared beneath his nails. The collapse continued. Dust filled the air so completely that the afternoon sun vanished behind a cloud of earth. Then, silence. An enormous crater remained where the well had stood only moments earlier. Ranger refused to retreat. Ignoring the pain in his bleeding paws, he kept digging, kept barking, kept searching. Far below the collapsed earth, Ethan slowly opened his eyes. His head throbbed. Every muscle screamed. He reached blindly across rough stone until his fingers found the flashlight. Miraculously, it still worked. The weak beam flickered. Its pale light revealed something impossible. He was no longer inside a collapsed well. He lay on a smooth stone floor inside a vast underground chamber. Massive carved pillars disappeared into darkness. Ancient walls stretched far beyond the reach of his flashlight. And somewhere ahead, something enormous reflected a faint shimmer of gold. Ethan remained perfectly still. His military instincts returned before his thoughts did. He listened. No voices, no dripping water, no movement except the slow settling of dust somewhere behind him. He carefully tested his arms. Bruised. His left shoulder ached fiercely where the collapse had thrown him against stone. His ribs hurt with every breath. But nothing felt broken. He picked up the flashlight and slowly swept its trembling beam across the chamber. The light revealed walls unlike anything he had ever imagined. Each massive stone block had been carefully shaped and fitted together without visible mortar. Centuries of dust covered every surface, yet the craftsmanship remained astonishingly precise. Thick stone columns disappeared into darkness overhead, supporting a ceiling far beyond the flashlight's reach. The air felt surprisingly cool. Cooler than the well. Cooler than any cave he had entered during military training. Most surprising of all, it smelled clean. Not fresh exactly. Ancient. Dry limestone mixed with earth that had remained untouched for generations. Ethan turned toward the opening where the collapse had dropped him. Nothing. The shaft had completely disappeared beneath tons of fallen rock. No daylight remained. No way back. He looked upward. Ranger. Only silence answered. His chest tightened. For years, the thought of losing Ranger had haunted him more than his own death. He closed his eyes. You're alive. He spoke the words aloud, as though the dog could somehow hear him. I know you're alive. Because Ranger never quit. Not once. Not ever. Holding the flashlight in one hand, Ethan slowly stood. His boots echoed softly across the stone floor. The golden reflection appeared again. Closer now. As he approached, the beam revealed the outline of an enormous sculpture. His breathing stopped. A life-sized bull stood upon a carved stone platform. Its head faced forward. Its horns curved proudly toward the ceiling. Every muscle had been sculpted with astonishing realism. Even beneath centuries of dust, the statue glowed with a deep golden brilliance unlike polished modern metal. Ethan circled it slowly. He reached out but hesitated before touching it. Finally, his fingertips brushed the surface. Cold. Solid. Real. This can't be. The words faded into the darkness. The flashlight revealed intricate carvings covering the platform beneath the bull. They were not decorative patterns. They resembled maps. Long, winding channels stretched across the stone. Some branched outward. Others converged toward symbols carved into circles and mountains. Ethan crouched lower. The lines looked strangely familiar. Not roads, waterways. Underground water flows. He traced one carefully with his finger. The carving continued beneath the bull itself. Whoever had built this place had not hidden treasure. They had documented something. Nearby lay rusted iron tools, unlike modern equipment. Hand-forged picks, stone hammers, wooden handles that had long since decayed into fragments. Broken pottery rested against one wall. A leather bucket had hardened into something resembling stone. This had been a workplace. Not a royal tomb, not a treasure vault, a place where people had labored. He slowly turned in a complete circle. The chamber extended farther than his flashlight could reach. Several unfinished tunnels branched away into darkness. Each one ended abruptly beneath collapsed rock. Some walls still carried chisel marks where workers had stopped in the middle of carving. It felt as though everyone had simply disappeared. Far above, sunlight warmed the dry valley. Ranger had not moved. His front paws bled freely now from clawing at loose earth. Every instinct told him Ethan remained alive somewhere below. He barked again, louder, longer. When no answer came, he sprinted away from the crater, not toward the bunkhouse, toward the county road. His tired body moved with surprising speed despite his age. Dust flew behind him. Several miles away, volunteer fire captain Wade Collins was inspecting equipment outside the small station when he noticed an old German shepherd racing directly toward him. The dog didn't slow down. He stopped only long enough to bark furiously before turning back toward the hills. What in the world? One firefighter recognized him immediately. That's Ethan Cross's dog. Ranger barked again, then ran several yards, stopped, looked back, repeated the sequence. Captain Collins narrowed his eyes. He's leading us somewhere. Within minutes, 2 brush trucks and a rescue vehicle followed the determined German shepherd across winding ranch roads. Ranger never hesitated once. He chose every turn with complete confidence. Back underground, Ethan continued exploring. The flashlight flickered. Its battery wouldn't last forever. He needed another way out. He chose the widest unfinished tunnel and began walking. The passage sloped gently upward. Hope returned. Maybe another exit existed. 20 yards. 30, 40. Then, solid rock. The tunnel ended beneath an ancient collapse. He tried another. The same result. A third. Blocked. Every route had failed. He returned to the chamber. His breathing became heavier. Stay calm. Assess. Adapt. Survive. The words from SEAL training echoed clearly inside his mind. Panic solves nothing. He forced himself to inventory everything. 1 flashlight. Half-full canteen. Pocket knife. 50 feet of rope buried somewhere above. No food, no communication, no visible exit. His eyes returned to the carved platform. Something caught his attention. Several symbols repeated over and over, not words, images, a mountain, a spring, the bull. Human figures carrying tools, others kneeling beside flowing water. One figure appeared to lift both hands toward the sky, while streams spread across farmland. Water. Always water. Never gold. He brushed away another layer of dust. More carvings emerged. The bull stood not beside treasure, but beside wells. Dozens of wells. Different sizes, connected by carefully carved channels. This wasn't about riches. He whispered the realization before he fully understood it. It was about survival. Above ground, Ranger reached the collapsed shaft, with the firefighters close behind. Captain Collins climbed from his truck and stared at the enormous crater. My God. The fresh collapse was obvious. One firefighter pointed toward scattered tools half buried beneath dirt. Another found Ethan's hat. Captain Collins looked at Ranger. The dog stood directly above one section of the collapse. Not moving. Not barking now. Simply staring downward. He knows exactly where his owner is. Rescue crews immediately began unloading shovels, ropes, listening equipment, and excavation tools. No heavy machinery could be used. The unstable ground might collapse even farther. Every minute mattered. Captain Collins knelt beside Ranger. "We're going to get him." The old German shepherd looked into the firefighter's eyes for one brief moment, then returned his attention to the earth. Waiting. Listening. Refusing to abandon his partner. Deep underground, Ethan leaned against one of the stone columns. His flashlight dimmed again. He needed to conserve every remaining minute of battery life. He switched it off. Darkness swallowed the chamber completely. For the first time in years, his PTSD surged with terrifying force. The crushing blackness, the confined space, the silence. His heartbeat accelerated. His breathing became uneven. The chamber no longer felt ancient. It felt like collapsed buildings. Buried bunkers. Places where friends had once cried for help. He squeezed his eyes shut. No. Not here. Not now. He pressed both hands against the cold stone floor. He could almost feel Ranger beside him, waiting, grounding him. Steady. Just as he had after every nightmare. Ethan inhaled slowly, count. 1, 2, 3, 4, exhale, again. The panic gradually loosened its grip. When he finally opened his eyes, he switched on the flashlight once more. The fading beam landed on the golden bull. For one extraordinary moment, the statue no longer looked like treasure. It looked like a silent guardian, watching over generations of people who had sacrificed everything in search of one thing more precious than gold. Water. The realization settled over Ethan like the cool air inside the chamber. For a few quiet moments, he forgot about the darkness, forgot about the collapsed well, forgot about the bruises spreading across his body. He stood before the enormous golden bull, with one hand resting gently against the carved platform. "Who were you?" he whispered into the silence. The chamber offered no answer, only echoes. Far above, however, the world had already begun changing. Captain Wade Collins organized the rescue site with practiced efficiency. Volunteers from neighboring ranches arrived carrying generators, floodlights, ropes, first aid kits, and portable pumps. Luis Herrera worked shoulder to shoulder with firefighters, digging carefully by hand wherever Ranger insisted they concentrate. Margaret Doyle arrived carrying old county maps tucked beneath her arm. She stared at the massive collapse. "Oh, Ethan." Captain Collins approached. "You know this property better than anyone? I've studied its history for years. Anything underneath?" She slowly shook her head. "Nothing that's ever been recorded." Ranger barked sharply. Every head turned. The old German shepherd stood over one narrow section of the collapse, refusing to move. Captain Collins knelt beside him. "That's where we're going." Nobody argued. If the dog who had survived combat beside a Navy SEAL believed his partner was alive, that was enough. Deep underground, Ethan continued examining the chamber. His flashlight had grown noticeably weaker. He needed to learn as much as possible before darkness claimed the room again. The unfinished tunnels fascinated him. Each one bore unmistakable signs of determined labor. Hammer marks, chisel grooves, broken supports abandoned where workers had once struggled through solid limestone. Nothing suggested greed. Everything suggested purpose. Near one wall he discovered several stone jars. Most had crumbled into fragments. One remained almost intact. Inside lay nothing but hardened sediment. No coins, no jewels, no precious artifacts, only traces of minerals left behind by evaporated water. His pulse quickened. Water had once existed here. He looked back toward the carved maps beneath the bull. The winding channels suddenly made more sense. These people hadn't hidden treasure. They had searched desperately for groundwater. Exactly as he had. His fingers traced another carved line leading toward a symbol resembling the surrounding hills. Then another, and another. The maps seemed almost practical. Engineering rather than decoration. Military experience had taught Ethan how terrain could be translated into symbols. These carvings followed similar logic. Measurements, directions, flow. Whoever created them wanted someone else to finish the work. A distant sound interrupted his thoughts. He froze. Tap. Very faint. Then silence. He held his breath. Another tap. Barely audible. His heart leaped. Someone above? He hurried toward the collapsed section where daylight had once existed. "Then," he shouted. His voice echoed violently through the chamber. He listened. Nothing. Only silence. Perhaps he had imagined it. Perhaps shifting stone had produced the sound. Still, hope returned. Above ground, rescuers paused repeatedly to use sensitive listening equipment lowered through narrow openings between the rocks. Most attempts revealed nothing, just the groaning of unstable earth. Hours passed. The Texas sun drifted westward. Dust covered every face. No one complained. Captain Collins checked his watch. "We rotate every 30 minutes. Luis shook his head. "I'm staying." "So am I," another volunteer answered. Margaret quietly handed out cold water. Nobody left. Ranger never accepted a single break. His bleeding paws stained the pale limestone red. Each time someone tried to pull him back for treatment, he returned to the exact same place overlooking the collapse. Watching. Waiting. Listening. Late that afternoon, the rescue team finally opened a narrow vertical crack extending several feet into the collapse. Captain Collins lowered a camera. Nothing. Just rock. Another opening. More debris. Then a third. Still nothing. The chamber remained hidden beneath layers of ancient stone. Meanwhile, word spread far beyond the valley. Someone posted photographs of the collapse online. Local television stations arrived first. Then, regional reporters. Satellite trucks soon lined the narrow county road. The headlines appeared before anyone knew the truth. Homeless veteran trapped in well massive collapse during water search, courage or desperation. By sunrise the next morning, helicopters circled overhead. The quiet ranch no longer belonged to silence. County deputies established temporary barriers. Reporters shouted questions whenever volunteers emerged from the excavation. Was treasure involved? Did he discover something underground? Is he still alive? Nobody had answers. Inside the chamber, Ethan conserved every movement. He drank only small sips from his canteen. His flashlight now flickered every few minutes. He found a relatively level section beside the golden bull and sat down. His body demanded rest. His mind refused. He looked once more toward the carved maps. One section caught his attention. Unlike the others, this area included small symbols shaped almost like stars. He brushed away centuries of dust. The stars connected to lines. The lines connected to circles. The circles surrounded what appeared to be springs, not stars. Markers. Survey points. His military navigation training stirred forgotten instincts. These weren't artistic carvings. They were field maps. Accurate enough that another team could continue the excavation centuries later. He smiled despite the situation. Whoever you were. He glanced toward the enormous bull. You planned ahead. Above ground, a convoy of black government SUVs rolled slowly through the temporary checkpoint. County officials stepped aside as several sharply dressed men and women emerged carrying identification cases. Captain Collins frowned. You folks are early. A middle-aged woman extended official credentials. State Historical Preservation Office. Another man followed. Texas Archaeological Survey. Behind them came two federal representatives. One surveyor, 3 security officers. Within minutes, they surrounded the command table. Margaret watched uneasily. You haven't even rescued him yet. The lead archaeologist looked toward the collapsed well. If reports are accurate. He paused carefully. This site may already qualify as a protected historical location. Captain Collins stared at him. We have a man trapped underground. Of course. But if significant artifacts exist, Luis interrupted sharply. Our friend comes first. The archaeologist nodded politely. Naturally. Yet his eyes remained fixed on the collapsed excavation rather than the men risking their lives to save Ethan. More vehicles arrived throughout the afternoon. Geologists, survey teams, government attorneys. A drone photographed the property from above. Temporary fencing appeared around sections of the ranch. Yellow stakes marked boundaries no one had mentioned before. Margaret watched workers driving those stakes into Eleanor Brooks's land. Something about it unsettled her deeply. They're moving awfully fast. Captain Collins followed her gaze. They're preparing for something. What? He didn't answer. Because he already suspected. Deep underground, Ethan finally heard the sound again. Much clearer this time. Tap, 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 not random. Rhythmic, human. He sprang to his feet. Ranger! His voice echoed across the chamber. Then he struck the stone wall 3 times with the metal flashlight. Bang. 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 He waited. For several long seconds. Nothing. Then, faintly through layers of ancient limestone, 3 answering knocks. Ranger had found him. And for the first time since the collapse, Ethan knew he was not alone. He pressed both hands against the cold limestone wall. 3 knocks. He answered with 3 more. The response came again, faint but unmistakable. A smile slowly crossed his face. "Good boy," he whispered. "You found me." The distance between them remained impossible to measure, separated by tons of rock and centuries of buried earth. Yet the simple exchange changed everything. Hope was no longer an idea. It had become real. Above ground, Ranger stood motionless over the section where rescue crews had been working since sunrise. His ears remained fixed on the earth beneath his paws. Captain Wade Collins lowered himself beside the dog. "You hear him, don't you?" Ranger gave one sharp bark. The firefighters exchanged hopeful glances. He answered. Luis Herrera smiled for the first time in 2 days. "I told you that dog knew." Captain Collins immediately radioed the excavation teams. "Shift everyone 5 feet east. We have contact through the rock. Work slow. Nobody rushes this." Heavy machinery remained parked far from the collapse. Every shovel of dirt was removed by hand. Every stone was lifted carefully. One careless movement could destroy the only chamber keeping Ethan alive. Television cameras continued filming from behind the security barriers. Their headlines had already changed. Rescuers establish contact. Former Navy SEAL believed alive. But another story was quietly unfolding beyond the cameras. The newly arrived archaeologists had begun examining fragments of carved stone recovered from the collapse. Dr. Amelia Hensley, the senior archaeologist assigned to the site, brushed dust from one broken fragment before stopping abruptly. "Interesting." One of her assistants leaned closer. "What is it?" She turned the stone toward the light. Carved into its surface was part of a carefully engraved channel. "This isn't decorative." "What do you mean?" "It looks like engineering." She frowned thoughtfully. "Not religious, not ceremonial, practical." She looked toward the collapsed excavation. "If more of this exists underground..." Her sentence remained unfinished. Captain Collins overheard enough to interrupt. "Right now, we're focused on bringing Ethan home." Dr. Hensley nodded respectfully. "Of course." Yet curiosity had already taken hold. Underground, Ethan carefully examined every inch of the chamber while conserving his flashlight. He could not waste the time rescue crews were buying him. If the chamber contained clues, someone needed to understand them before confusion or greed buried the truth forever. He returned to the Golden Bull. Without the panic of the previous hours clouding his thoughts, he noticed details he had missed before. The bull's eyes were not fierce. They were calm. Its head faced slightly downward instead of charging forward, almost protective. The platform beneath it contained dozens of finely carved figures. Men, women, children. Some carried baskets. Others pushed crude carts. Several held digging tools over their shoulders. Not soldiers. Workers. Families. People building something together. He slowly followed the carvings from one end of the platform to the other. The story unfolded in stone. A dry valley. Groups of laborers digging. Collapsed tunnels. Exhausted workers helping one another stand. Then, flowing water. Fields. Homes. Animals drinking. The bull remained in every scene, never worshipped, never surrounded by treasure, always standing beside water. Ethan felt an unexpected lump rise in his throat. They weren't chasing gold. He looked around the chamber. They were trying to save people. His flashlight swept across another wall. There, almost hidden beneath centuries of dust, stretched an enormous carved map, unlike the smaller ones beneath the statue. This one covered nearly 20 feet of stone. He stepped closer. Mountains, creeks, natural springs, rock formations. The geography resembled the valley above. Not perfectly, but remarkably close. Several narrow lines converged beneath what appeared to be the exact location of the ranch, then spread outward toward surrounding properties. Water distribution. His military background made the design immediately recognizable. It resembled logistics planning. Move resources here. Support everyone. Protect the whole area. This had been an organized engineering effort, not random excavation. He carefully brushed more dust away. Near the bottom of the map appeared a row of unfamiliar symbols. Not English, not Spanish, not any language he recognized. Still, one symbol repeated again and again beside the underground channels. A circle. 3 descending lines, then another circle. Perhaps wells, perhaps springs. Whatever they represented, they formed a connected network. He looked back toward the unfinished tunnels. Most had collapsed before reaching their destination. His eyes drifted upward. They almost made it. The realization struck him with surprising force. Generations before modern drilling equipment, people had nearly reached the aquifer. Outside, another day passed. Volunteers continued rotating through the rescue effort. Margaret Doyle remained beneath a canvas shelter, surrounded by stacks of dusty county records. She refused to go home. Every old survey, every handwritten journal, every forgotten map, she examined them one by one. Late that afternoon, she stopped abruptly. What is this? Folded inside an 1894 county survey lay a much older document copied by hand decades earlier. The faded notes referenced an abandoned frontier excavation. No exact location, only a sentence written in elegant cursive. The old builders sought the river beneath the stone but were forced to abandon the work after repeated cave-ins. Margaret's pulse quickened. She hurried toward Dr. Hensley. You need to read this. The archaeologist carefully studied the fragile page. Her expression slowly changed. This isn't a treasure expedition. No. Margaret pointed toward the valley. It never was. Dr. Hensley looked back toward the rescue operation. If this document is accurate, she spoke quietly, then the chamber below may be part of one of the earliest organized groundwater engineering projects in this region. Captain Collins overheard her, so Ethan wasn't digging above buried riches. Dr. Hensley slowly shook her head. He may have uncovered the unfinished work of people trying to find water. The words spread quietly among the volunteers. Nobody celebrated. Instead, they looked differently at the land surrounding them. Suddenly, every dry pasture carried another story. Every abandoned ranch became another reminder of why those forgotten builders had sacrificed so much. Deep underground, Ethan discovered one final detail. Behind the golden bull stood a narrow stone pillar no wider than his shoulders. Its front face contained hundreds of tiny engraved marks arranged in neat columns. Unlike the maps, these resembled written records. He could not read them. But near the bottom, one image stood alone, a man extending both hands toward another. Beside them stood the bull. Behind them flowed water toward distant homes. No crown, no treasure chest, no riches, only service. Ethan smiled quietly. It wasn't about owning the water. He looked toward the ancient chamber stretching into darkness. It was about sharing it. At that same moment, rescue crews finally opened a narrow passage large enough to lower a small fiber-optic camera through the fractured rock. Captain Collins watched the monitor. Dust filled the screen. Stone. More stone. Then, an open space. The camera slowly rotated. The beam of light swept across a carved column, across scattered tools, across an enormous golden surface reflecting brilliantly even beneath centuries of dust. Everyone around the monitor fell silent. Dr. Hensley whispered almost involuntarily. My God. Captain Collins wasn't looking at the statue. His eyes searched the darkness beyond it. Then a familiar figure stepped into the beam. Dirty, bruised, exhausted, but standing. Ethan looked directly into the camera. He smiled, then raised one hand in a military thumbs up. Above ground, Ranger let out a single joyful bark that echoed across the valley. The rescue team erupted in relieved applause, but beyond the celebration, news of the Golden Bull had already begun spreading far beyond Texas. And somewhere, hundreds of miles away, a powerful real estate developer named Victor Langford quietly turned off his television, leaned back in his chair, and smiled for an entirely different reason. He had spent the last 5 years buying bankrupt ranches throughout the valley, one desperate family at a time. Every drought had lowered another asking price. Every foreclosure had created another opportunity. He never cared much about cattle. He cared about land. Now, according to every news station in the state, one forgotten ranch sat on top of an archaeological discovery that could transform the region forever. Victor pressed a button on his desk. His attorney entered moments later. You saw the report? I did. Victor slid a map across the polished oak surface. Colored pins covered nearly every surrounding property. We already control almost 30% of this valley. His attorney studied the television replay showing firefighters lowering supplies into the underground chamber. The owner survived. Victor smiled. For now. The attorney looked up. You intend to buy him out? I intend to make sure he can't afford to refuse. Back in Texas, the rescue operation entered its 3rd day. Engineers finally completed a reinforced access shaft beside the collapse. Steel supports lined every few feet. Carefully, rescue specialists lowered Captain Wade Collins and another firefighter into the darkness. When Ethan saw the first rescue helmet appear through the opening, he let out a long breath he hadn't realized he had been holding. Captain Collins stepped into the chamber and removed his helmet. I've seen a lot of strange rescues. He slowly turned toward the Golden Bull. But nothing like this. Ethan smiled weakly. Good to see you too. The two men shook hands. Neither spoke for several seconds. The silence carried everything words could not. "You all right?" "Banged up." Captain Collins looked him over. "You've looked worse." "I definitely have." "And Ranger?" The question mattered more than anything else. Captain Collins smiled. "He's waiting for you." Ethan closed his eyes briefly. Thank God. Minutes later, rescue workers fitted Ethan with a climbing harness. Before ascending, he looked back one final time at the underground chamber. The golden bull stood exactly where it had for centuries. Calm, silent, watching. Something told him this would not be his last visit. As the lift slowly carried him upward through the reinforced shaft, daylight gradually returned. The brightness almost hurt. Then came the barking. Powerful, relentless, filled with unmistakable relief. Ranger. Before the rescue basket even touched the surface, the old German shepherd pushed past firefighters and deputies, scrambling toward Ethan despite the bandages wrapped around his bleeding front paws. Easy. Captain Collins laughed. He hasn't listened to anybody for 3 days. The moment Ethan stepped onto solid ground, Ranger leaned his entire body against him. Ethan dropped to one knee despite the pain in his ribs. His arms wrapped around the old dog. For several long moments, neither moved. The gathered crowd quietly looked away. Some firefighters wiped their eyes. Luis Herrera removed his hat. Margaret Doyle smiled through tears. "You found me," Ethan whispered. Ranger answered by resting his muzzle against Ethan's shoulder. The cameras captured everything. Within hours, the reunion spread across television broadcasts and social media across the country. Many people talked about the golden bull. Most remembered the dog. Doctors insisted Ethan spend the night at the county hospital. X-rays confirmed cracked ribs, severe bruising, dehydration, and exhaustion. Fortunately, nothing required surgery. Ranger received treatment beside him. The veterinarian carefully cleaned the deep cuts on both front paws. "You've got one stubborn partner." Ethan gently scratched behind Ranger's ears. He learned from the best. The veterinarian smiled. "So did you." The peaceful moment lasted less than 24 hours. The next morning, Ethan returned to the ranch expecting to see firefighters packing equipment. Instead, he found chain-link fencing, temporary floodlights, security checkpoints, government vehicles, uniformed officers. The entrance road had become almost unrecognizable. A deputy stepped forward politely. "Mr. Cross." "That's me." "I'm afraid public access has been restricted." Ethan looked past him. "My home is on the other side of that fence." "I understand." The deputy shifted uncomfortably. "The archaeological site has been placed under emergency state protection, pending investigation." "My bunkhouse." "You may retrieve personal belongings with an escort." "My well?" "Currently closed." "My land?" The deputy hesitated. The protected zone includes approximately 40 acres surrounding the discovery. Ethan stared across the fence. The pecan tree stood inside the restricted area. So did the collapsed shaft. The place where Eleanor had asked him to save the ranch. The place Ranger had chosen. Now signs surrounded it. "Authorized personnel only. State protected site." No entry. Ethan looked at the deputy. I dug that well. I know. I almost died down there. I know. My dog saved my life. I know. So why am I standing outside my own fence? The deputy lowered his eyes. I don't make those decisions. Margaret Doyle arrived carrying a folder thick with documents. They've declared temporary emergency authority. Ethan accepted the papers. Every page contained legal language, environmental review, historical preservation, site protection, ownership investigation. Nothing clearly stated when or if he would regain full access. Television crews remained outside the barriers. Reporters immediately surrounded him. Mr. Cross, how much do you think the Golden Bull is worth? Do you believe you'll become a millionaire? Will you sell the ranch? Do you feel lucky? Ethan looked from one microphone to another, then back toward the fenced property. Finally, he answered quietly. I wasn't looking for gold. Most reporters paused. I was looking for water. His words appeared on evening broadcasts nationwide. Some praised his humility, others dismissed it as good publicity. Victor Langford watched every interview. So, he folded his hands. He doesn't care about the money. His attorney looked uncertain. Perhaps. Victor smiled again. Everyone cares about something. A week later, the first official meeting took place inside the county courthouse. State archaeologists, county commissioners, federal representatives, historical experts, engineers, lawyers. Ethan sat quietly beside Margaret Doyle. Ranger lay at his feet, bandaged paws stretched carefully across the polished floor. Dr. Amelia Hensley addressed the room first. Our preliminary examination indicates the chamber represents one of the most significant historical discoveries in Texas in decades. Slides filled the courtroom wall. Photographs of the Golden Bull, ancient tools, stone maps, the unfinished tunnels. The site appears connected to a large-scale historical effort to locate underground water resources. Murmurs spread through the audience. One commissioner leaned forward. So this wasn't hidden treasure? Doctor, Hensley shook her head. The evidence suggests otherwise. It appears these people were building an extensive groundwater project. Another official spoke. Nevertheless, the artifacts themselves possess extraordinary historical and monetary value. The room shifted. The conversation slowly changed. Less about history, more about ownership. One attorney represented the state, another represented the county. A third spoke on behalf of cultural preservation groups. Someone mentioned museum partnerships. Another referenced tourism revenue. Another discussed federal grants. Ethan listened quietly. Nobody had yet mentioned water. Nobody mentioned the drought. Nobody mentioned the abandoned ranches surrounding the valley. During a recess, a well-dressed man approached him in the hallway. Expensive suit, perfect smile, silver cufflinks. My name is Richard Sloan. He extended a business card. I represent several private investors. I'm not interested. You haven't heard the offer. I don't need to. Richard remained pleasant. My clients would like exclusive negotiating rights. No. We're prepared to discuss several $1 million. Ethan looked at the card without taking it. I said no. Richard smiled politely. My employer believes you'll eventually reconsider. As he walked away, Ethan turned the card over. There was no company logo, only a phone number. And embossed across the bottom, Langford Development Group. Ethan turned the card over once more before slipping it into his shirt pocket. He had never heard of Victor Langford before the courthouse meeting. Now the name seemed to appear everywhere. Every newspaper carried quotes from economic analysts discussing the historic discovery. Television commentators debated the value of the Golden Bull. Investors speculated about tourism. Real estate companies predicted soaring land prices throughout the valley. Everyone seemed fascinated by what lay beneath the ranch. Almost no one talked about why Ethan had started digging in the first place. Water. The drought continued without mercy. The cracked fields surrounding the protected site looked exactly as they had before the cameras arrived. Only now they stood behind temporary fences. Ranger limped quietly beside Ethan as they walked back toward the abandoned bunkhouse. His paws had begun healing, but each step remained careful. The veterinarian had warned Ethan to limit the old dog's activity for several weeks. Ranger ignored that advice whenever Ethan moved. He refused to stay behind. Inside the bunkhouse, the silence felt heavier than before. The place looked smaller now. Boxes of legal documents sat where ranch supplies once had. Letters from reporters covered the old kitchen table. 3 television networks wanted interviews. A museum offered to purchase personal rights to Ethan's story. 2 publishing companies asked about a memoir. He set every envelope aside unopened. None of them mattered. What mattered sat on the counter. A veterinary invoice. Ethan picked it up. Follow-up treatment. Medication. Physical therapy for Ranger's damaged paws. The veterinarian had quietly reduced the bill, but even the discounted amount exceeded everything Ethan had left. He folded the paper carefully. I'll figure it out. Ranger rested his head against Ethan's leg, as though he already believed him. The following morning, Margaret Doyle arrived carrying another stack of old records. I found something. They spread faded maps across the kitchen table. Survey drawings, handwritten journals, copies of military engineering reports preserved by the County Historical Society. Margaret adjusted her glasses. I've spent 3 nights reading everything I could find. She pointed to a faded map dated 1819. Look here. A series of hand-drawn lines stretched beneath the hills surrounding the valley. They believed a massive underground aquifer flowed beneath this entire region. Ethan studied the map. The carvings underground looked similar. Margaret nodded. I thought they might. She unfolded another document. This journal belonged to an Army surveyor assigned to frontier engineering. Ethan read several faded lines aloud. Water beneath these hills could sustain settlements for generations if reached. He looked up. They knew. They believed it. Margaret smiled sadly. They just didn't have the technology. Ethan thought about the unfinished tunnels, the broken tools, the workers carved into stone. They almost succeeded. Before Margaret could answer, another vehicle pulled into the yard. A black luxury SUV. It looked strangely out of place among the weathered fences and dusty mesquite. Richard Sloane stepped out carrying a leather briefcase. I hoped we might speak privately. Ethan remained on the porch. We already did. Richard smiled politely. I don't believe we finished. He opened the briefcase. Inside rested a thick folder. No contracts today. Then why are you here? My employer asked me to explain the opportunity more clearly. Ethan crossed his arms. I'm listening. Richard looked across the dry valley. Mr. Cross, your discovery has changed everything. I didn't discover it for money. I understand. Richard spoke calmly, which is exactly why you're the right person to protect it. He removed several papers. Independent appraisals estimate the historical site could generate hundreds of millions of dollars over the coming decades. Ethan remained expressionless. My client is prepared to offer you $5 million immediately. Margaret quietly looked away. Richard continued. In exchange, you would support a comprehensive development partnership. What kind of development? A museum. Hotels. Retail. Residential expansion. The valley would prosper. Ethan looked toward the distant abandoned ranches. Prosper for who? Richard hesitated. For everyone. Ethan smiled faintly. I've heard that sentence before. The representative continued as though he hadn't noticed. $5 million changes a man's life. Ethan said nothing. Richard glanced toward Ranger. I understand your dog requires ongoing treatment. The words landed harder than Ethan expected. You've been asking questions. We perform due diligence. My medical bills aren't your business. They become relevant when someone needs resources. Richard lowered his voice. You served your country. You've sacrificed enough. Take the money. Give your friend the care he deserves. For one dangerous moment, Ethan's resolve faltered. He imagined Ranger receiving every treatment available. A warm place to sleep. No more counting every dollar. No more wondering whether another bill could be paid. No more surviving 1 week at a time. $5 million. The number echoed through his thoughts. Richard noticed the silence. My employer believes this is a generous offer. It is. And Ethan looked down at Ranger. The old German shepherd met his eyes with the same steady trust he had shown beneath the pecan tree. No fear, no expectation, only loyalty. A memory surfaced unexpectedly. Years earlier. Afghanistan. A mountain trail. Ranger had discovered an explosive hidden beneath loose gravel. Without hesitation, the dog had thrown himself into Ethan, knocking him clear before the device detonated. The explosion had injured Ranger. Not Ethan. Months of recovery had followed. Not once had the dog hesitated to return to duty. Not once had he expected anything in return. Ethan slowly looked back at Richard Sloane. Tell me something. Of course. If I sell... Richard smiled. Yes? Will the first thing your company does be another search for water? Richard's smile faded almost imperceptibly. Our primary focus would be preserving the archaeological resource. The water. Our engineers would evaluate future possibilities. So, Ethan nodded slowly. That's a no. Richard closed the folder. I think you're allowing emotion to interfere with business. I think you're allowing business to interfere with people. The representative sighed. My employer anticipated this response. He reached into his jacket. One final envelope. If you change your mind. He placed it on the porch railing. The offer remains open for 30 days. Richard returned to the SUV and drove away. Neither Ethan nor Margaret touched the envelope. For several long moments, only the wind moved across the dry valley. Finally, Margaret spoke. $5 million. I know. You could buy almost anything. Ethan looked across the cracked fields. Not rain. That evening, he walked alone to the temporary fence surrounding the protected site. Security lights illuminated the distant excavation. Beyond them stood the old pecan tree. Ranger limped quietly beside him. The dog stopped near the fence and sat facing the place where the well had once been. Ethan rested one hand on the chain-link barrier. I almost forgot why we started. Ranger leaned gently against his leg. We weren't looking for gold. The dog remained perfectly still. We were looking for water. As the last light faded behind the Texas hills, Ethan stared across the valley. Empty ranches, dry fields, abandoned barns. Families forced to leave land their grandparents had built. The answer arrived with surprising clarity. If those ancient builders had spent their lives searching for water, then finishing their mission mattered more than owning the statue they had left behind. The next morning, Ethan called Margaret before sunrise. I need your help with what? I'm done talking about treasure. What are you going to do? Ethan looked toward the valley beginning to glow beneath the morning sun. I'm going to make them remember why that bull was built in the first place. Margaret Doyle studied him carefully. You've made a decision. I have. You know it may cost you everything. Ethan looked down at Ranger, who rested quietly beside the porch, his bandaged paws stretched into the early morning sunlight. I've already lost almost everything. The old German shepherd lifted his head as if he understood every word. Ethan smiled. But I still have a mission. By mid-morning, the county courthouse overflowed with reporters, historians, engineers, lawyers, and residents from every surrounding ranch. News cameras lined the walls. Microphones covered the front table. Victor Langford sat quietly near the back of the room beside his attorney, watching every movement without speaking. He wore an expensive navy suit that seemed strangely out of place among weathered ranchers in dusty boots. His expression remained calm, confident, as though the outcome had already been decided. Dr. Amelia Hensley stood first. Our archaeological team has completed the initial documentation of the underground chamber. Photographs appeared on a large projection screen. The golden bull, ancient tools, stone maps, the unfinished tunnels, the carved engineering diagrams. Our findings strongly support the conclusion that the chamber was never intended as a treasury. She paused. It was an engineering headquarters. Soft murmurs spread across the audience. The workers who built it appear to have dedicated their lives to locating a major underground aquifer. She pointed toward one enlarged image. The maps consistently identify underground water channels. Another slide appeared. The golden bull appears repeatedly as a symbol of endurance and shared labor. A county commissioner leaned forward. So the discovery itself has enormous historical value. It does. But the greater value may be the information preserved inside the chamber. The commissioner nodded. Can those maps still be useful? Dr. Hensley answered honestly. We don't know. The room grew quiet. If interpreted correctly. She looked toward Ethan. They might. Everyone turned toward him. Ethan stood slowly. He wasn't wearing a suit. Only faded jeans, worn boots, and the same brown work shirt he had worn while digging. Ranger rose beside him despite the tenderness still visible in his front paws. The old German shepherd remained pressed against Ethan's leg. A reporter called out. Mr. Cross, are you selling your rights? Another asked, what's the golden bull worth? A third shouted, are you accepting Langford's offer? Ethan stepped to the microphone. For several seconds, he simply looked around the room. At neighbors who had nearly lost their ranches. At firefighters who had pulled him from the earth. At Margaret. At Captain Collins. At Dr. Hensley. Finally, he spoke. I think everyone keeps asking the wrong question. Silence settled across the courthouse. They keep asking what the bull is worth. He looked toward the photographs. The people who carved those tunnels never asked that. His voice remained calm. They asked where the water was. Several ranchers slowly nodded. My friend Daniel Brooks gave his life serving this country. My friend Eleanor asked me not to let this ranch die. I dug that well because families here were losing everything. He looked directly toward the cameras. I wasn't searching for gold. I was searching for water. No one interrupted him. So if this discovery belongs to history... He paused. Then history deserves to finish what those builders started. Victor Langford's confident smile faded slightly. Ethan continued. If compensation is ever paid because of this discovery, he glanced around the room. I don't want it. The courthouse became perfectly still. Instead of surprise, Ethan saw disbelief spreading across dozens of faces. I have one condition. Every camera focused on him. Every dollar connected to this site should be placed into a permanent groundwater restoration fund. He pointed toward the valley beyond the courthouse windows. Not one ranch. Every ranch. Every family. Every community that has been waiting for rain. Whispers erupted throughout the audience. Victor leaned toward his attorney. What is he doing? His attorney answered quietly. If public opinion turns... Victor's jaw tightened. Ethan wasn't finished. Bring in the best hydrologists, the best engineers, study every map beneath that chamber. If those people came within a few feet of reaching the aquifer 200 years ago, his voice strengthened, then we owe it to them to finish the job. Applause began with Luis Herrera, then Captain Collins, then Margaret. Within seconds, the entire courtroom stood. Everyone except Victor Langford. The following week, the state approved the formation of the Valley Groundwater Restoration Project. Engineers from universities arrived alongside geological survey teams. Three-dimensional scans of the underground chamber were completed before excavation resumed. Every carved line was measured, every symbol catalogued. The ancient maps became the center of intense study. Modern computer models compared them with satellite imaging. Most experts remained cautious. The carvings are remarkable, but they may not be precise enough. Others disagreed. The builders understood this land. They simply lacked modern drilling equipment. Weeks passed. Several promising drilling locations were identified. The first attempt failed. Only dry limestone. The second reached fractured rock. Nothing. The third produced a small pocket of damp soil. Then nothing more. Television crews slowly disappeared. Headlines changed. Critics began calling the project a waste of taxpayer money. Victor Langford quietly increased his pressure behind closed doors. The maps are symbolic. The aquifer doesn't exist. The land should be commercially developed. His influence reached county commissioners, editorial pages, investment groups. Each failed drilling attempt strengthened his argument. One evening, Ethan stood beside the fourth drilling rig as workers packed away equipment. Another failure. An exhausted engineer removed his hard hat. I don't understand. He unfolded another copy of the carved map. Everything lines up. It should be here. Ethan looked across the valley. The setting sun painted the dry grass bronze. Ranger wandered slowly away from the crew. Nobody paid much attention. The old dog sniffed the breeze, then the ground. He continued walking almost 50 yards beyond the engineer's survey markers. He stopped, lowered his nose, circled once, then began scratching insistently at the earth, not casually, purposefully. Exactly as he had beneath the pecan tree weeks earlier. Ethan watched him. The memory struck instantly. Same posture, same determination, same quiet certainty. He walked toward the dog. What is it, partner? Ranger scratched again, then barked once. The lead engineer looked up. Everything okay? Ethan didn't answer immediately. Instead, he knelt beside Ranger and studied the ground. Nothing appeared unusual, just another patch of dry Texas soil. The engineer walked over carrying rolled survey maps. We already checked this section. Ethan looked from the maps to Ranger. The old German shepherd never took his eyes off him. Finally, Ethan stood. I know your instruments. The engineer nodded. And I know my partner. A few crew members exchanged uncertain glances. The engineer smiled politely. You want us to move $1 million drilling rig? He looked at Ranger. Because your dog picked another spot? Ethan met his eyes without hesitation. He was right, once. Ranger scratched the ground again. Harder this time, as though the earth itself refused to give up its final secret. Ranger stopped scratching only long enough to look at Ethan. There was no uncertainty in the old dog's eyes, only quiet conviction. The drilling crew gathered around the weathered German shepherd. Several smiled politely. Others exchanged doubtful glances. The lead engineer, Thomas Avery, unfolded the latest survey map across the hood of a pickup truck. We've already scanned this area twice, he said. Ground-penetrating radar didn't show anything unusual. Ethan knelt beside Ranger and rested one hand on the dog's neck. I've heard that before. Thomas looked at him. The chamber. Ethan nodded. Every map said the first shaft should have been the right place. He smiled faintly. It wasn't. The engineer looked toward the ancient pecan tree in the distance. and your dog moved you 6 feet. He saved my life." Silence settled over the group. Thomas folded the map. "Moving the rig will cost us another day." Luis Herrera stepped forward. "We've already spent months." Margaret Doyle added quietly, "If the people who built those tunnels gave years of their lives," she smiled toward Ranger, "I think we can spare one more day." Captain Wade Collins crossed his arms. "I've learned something during this whole mess." Everyone looked at him. "When that dog insists on something," he shrugged, "I stop arguing." Thomas laughed softly. "I can't believe I'm about to redesign a drilling plan because of a retired military K9. Ethan smiled. "You won't regret it." By sunrise the following morning, massive equipment slowly rolled across the valley. The drilling platform was repositioned exactly where Ranger had scratched the earth. Several television crews had returned after hearing rumors that another attempt would be made. Most expected another disappointment. Victor Langford watched the live coverage from his office. His attorney stood nearby. "If this one fails," Victor nodded, "the project dies." And then, people stopped chasing water. He looked toward the television and started selling land. Back at the ranch, the drilling rig towered above the dry earth. Its steel frame reflected the bright Texas morning. Workers completed the final safety checks. Thomas Avery walked toward Ethan. "This is your last miracle." Ethan looked at Ranger. "I don't believe in miracles." The engineer raised an eyebrow. "No. I believe in loyalty." Ranger sat quietly beside them, his graying muzzle lifted toward the breeze. Thomas climbed into the control cabin. The massive drill slowly began rotating. Steel bit into the earth. Dust rose immediately. Everyone watched. The first 50 feet passed quickly. Nothing. 100 feet. Dry limestone. 150. Still dry. Several reporters began packing equipment. One cameraman muttered, "Same story." Thomas looked discouraged. "We're entering the same geological layer that stopped the last attempt." Ethan remained calm. "Keep going." 200 feet. The drill slowed. Hard rock. The engine strained. Workers exchanged worried looks. Then, the vibration changed. Not dramatically, just enough for experienced operators to notice. Thomas looked at the monitoring screen. "Pressure's different." One technician frowned. "I'm seeing fractured material." Another called out, "Moisture increase." Thomas leaned closer. "Check the sensors again." The numbers continued climbing. Very slowly, then faster. Outside, Ranger suddenly stood. His ears pointed toward the drilling platform. His tail remained perfectly still. He took several careful steps forward, then stopped. Every muscle in his body became rigid. Ethan recognized the posture instantly. The same alert stance Ranger had used before finding hidden danger during deployments. Only this time, the dog wasn't warning of danger. He was waiting. Thomas's voice crackled over the radio. "We've entered a cavity." The drilling crew became instantly alert. Pressure readings climbed sharply. One technician shouted, "Water pressure! Another answered, "No! Too much pressure!" Thomas grabbed the emergency controls. "Everyone back!" Workers quickly moved away from the drilling platform. The drill penetrated another few feet. For one heartbeat, nothing happened. Then a deep rumble rolled beneath the valley. The ground vibrated, not violently, powerfully, as though something enormous had awakened far below. A sharp hiss escaped from the drill casing. Then, a deafening roar exploded skyward. A towering column of crystal-clear water burst from the earth with astonishing force. It shot nearly 40 feet into the air before falling back in glittering sheets beneath the Texas sun. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. After years of drought, after generations of searching, the valley heard the sound of living water again. Luis Herrera removed his hat. Margaret Doyle covered her mouth with both hands. Several engineers simply stared upward in disbelief. Thomas Avery laughed out loud. "I've never been happier to be wrong." The water continued surging. Cold, clear, endless. Children from neighboring ranches who had come to watch began cheering. Firefighters applauded. Workers embraced one another. Even reporters lowered their cameras for a moment to witness the scene with their own eyes. Ethan never looked at the fountain. He looked at Ranger. The old German shepherd remained exactly where he had stopped, watching quietly, as though he had expected this all along. Ethan walked over and knelt beside him. Without saying a word, he removed his work gloves and scooped water into his hands. He held them beneath Ranger's muzzle. "Go ahead." The old dog drank slowly, patiently. The first fresh groundwater to emerge from beneath the valley in generations. Only after Ranger finished did Ethan kneel beside the flowing stream himself. He cupped the icy water in both hands. It tasted clean, pure, alive. He closed his eyes. For an instant he imagined Daniel Brooks standing beside him. He imagined Eleanor smiling from the porch of the old farmhouse. He imagined the forgotten workers beneath the golden bull finally completing the mission they had begun centuries earlier. When he opened his eyes again, the entire valley seemed transformed. Not because the grass had already turned green. It hadn't. Not because every problem had disappeared. They hadn't. But because hope had become something visible, something flowing, something real. Within days, engineers confirmed the discovery. The ancient maps had been accurate. The underground chamber had marked the edge of one of the largest aquifers in the region. Additional wells could now be drilled throughout the valley using the restored groundwater model. Families who had already packed moving trucks quietly unpacked them again. Abandoned ranches received visitors for the first time in years. Old windmills began turning once more. The first irrigation channels carried water across fields that had forgotten what moisture felt like. Victor Langford watched the news in silence. His attorney finally spoke. "The land values are rising." Victor nodded. "But not for us." He switched off the television without another word. At sunset, Ethan stood beneath the old pecan tree where everything had begun. Ranger lay beside him, tired but peaceful. The sound of flowing water echoed softly across the valley. For the first time in many years, it no longer sounded like survival. It sounded like home. The water continued flowing through the night. Under the pale glow of the moon, The new well shimmered like liquid silver, its steady current feeding temporary holding tanks before engineers directed it toward the first irrigation lines. For the first time in years, the valley did not fall asleep wondering whether tomorrow would bring enough water to survive. Instead, people spoke about planting again, about rebuilding, about staying. Weeks passed. The transformation came slowly, almost too slowly to notice at first. The brittle brown grass softened into patches of green. Wildflowers appeared along fence lines that had been lifeless for years. The old windmill beside the abandoned barn turned again, creaking with familiar rhythm as fresh groundwater filled the storage tank beneath it. Neighbors who had once gathered only to mourn another foreclosure now gathered to repair fences, replace broken gates, and clear neglected fields. Luis Herrera was the first to bring cattle back. Only 12 head. Not many. But when Ethan watched them lower their heads to drink from a restored watering trough, he smiled more deeply than he had in years. Margaret Doyle reopened the tiny historical room inside the old county library. Children from nearby schools began visiting to learn about the ancient chamber beneath the ranch. She never started with the golden bull. She started with a single sentence written across a chalkboard. They searched for water so others could live. Then she told them about the people who had never given up. The ancient workers, the volunteers, the firefighters, and one old military dog. Ethan never became comfortable with the attention. Television crews continued requesting interviews. Documentary producers offered contracts. Publishers mailed proposals. He declined almost all of them. Most mornings still began the same way. Coffee on the porch, half poured into Ranger's bowl, half into his own cup. The only difference was that the water came from the well Ranger had found. The nightmares never disappeared completely. Some nights Ethan still woke suddenly, reaching for a rifle that wasn't there. His breathing would quicken. His pulse would race. Then he would feel a familiar weight against his knee. Ranger. Always Ranger. The old German shepherd no longer moved as quickly as he once had. His steps had become slower, more careful. The injuries to his front paws had healed, but age had quietly taken the strength from his joints. Sometimes he paused halfway across the yard before continuing. Sometimes he needed a little extra time to stand after lying down. The veterinarian noticed the changes immediately during a routine examination. Dr. Karen Mitchell gently ran her hands along Ranger's back. She listened to his heart, checked his eyes, flexed each leg. Finally, she removed her stethoscope and sat beside Ethan. His paws have healed well. Ethan nodded. I figured. But the single word hung between them. He served a long life. She smiled warmly at Ranger. A remarkable life. Ethan looked down without speaking. The arthritis is progressing. I know. His heart is getting weaker. Silence filled the examination room. Dr. Mitchell continued softly. He's comfortable. He's not suffering. But you should spend as much time with him as you can. Ethan reached down and scratched behind Ranger's ears. The old dog responded with the same gentle tail wag he had given thousands of times before. Nothing about it suggested sadness, only trust. That afternoon, Ethan drove nowhere. He simply took Ranger home. The following weeks became a season of quiet gratitude. They walked the ranch together every morning. Not far, just enough to greet the sunrise. Ranger still insisted on stopping beneath the old pecan tree every single day. He would sit there for several minutes, watching the well in the distance while cool water flowed steadily through the irrigation channels. Ethan often sat beside him. Neither needed words. One crisp autumn morning, veterans from neighboring counties arrived unexpectedly. Pickup trucks rolled slowly through the ranch entrance. Men and women stepped out wearing faded unit caps, old jackets, and weathered boots. Some carried canes. Others walked with artificial limbs. A few brought grandchildren. Captain Wade Collins smiled as he watched them gather. I don't think anyone invited them. Luis looked across the parking area. They invited themselves. An older Marine approached Ethan first. He extended a hand. Heard about your partner? Ethan shook it. Word travels. The Marine knelt beside Ranger. Without speaking, he carefully removed a challenge coin from his pocket. It bore the emblem of his old unit. He placed it gently on the ground beside the dog. Another veteran stepped forward. Then another. Soon dozens of challenge coins rested in a small circle around Ranger. Army, Navy, Marine Corps, Air Force, Coast Guard. Different uniforms, different wars. The same quiet respect. No speeches were planned. None were needed. One former combat medic finally spoke. We all knew a dog like him. Heads nodded throughout the crowd. He carried more than equipment. Another veteran smiled. He carried us. Ranger lifted his head slowly, looking from one familiar face to another. His tail brushed softly against the ground. The gathering ended with coffee, stories, and long conversations beneath the pecan tree. It felt less like a ceremony and more like family. Winter arrived gently that year. Not with heavy snow, just cool mornings and long golden afternoons. One morning, Ethan noticed Ranger did not rise immediately when he opened the bunkhouse door. The old dog looked toward him. His eyes were bright, peaceful, but tired. Very tired. Ethan sat beside him on the porch. You don't have to keep watching me every second anymore. Ranger rested his head against Ethan's shoulder, the same way he had after every nightmare. The same way he had before every mission. The same way he had beneath the collapsed well. They remained there for nearly an hour as the first sunlight reached across the valley. Water sparkled beneath the distant pecan tree. Birds returned to branches that had stood empty for years. The ranch no longer looked abandoned. It looked alive. Ranger slowly stood. His legs trembled slightly. Together they walked toward the tree one final time. Each step was slower than the last. When they reached the shade, Ranger circled once, then lay down facing the well, exactly where he had first refused to leave the ground months before. Ethan sat beside him. His hand rested gently on the dog's neck. You finished your mission. The breeze carried the sound of flowing water across the valley. Ranger looked toward Ethan, then toward the well. His breathing became softer, calmer. The old German shepherd closed his eyes. His final breath came so quietly that the wind almost carried it away. Ethan remained beside him for a long time. He did not call for help. He did not move. He simply stayed with the friend who had never left him. As the afternoon sun drifted lower, neighbors began arriving without being asked. Luis brought cedar boards. Captain Collins carried tools. Margaret arrived holding wildflowers gathered from the hillsides that had turned green again. The veterans returned before sunset. Together, they chose a resting place beneath the old pecan tree overlooking the well. The challenge coins placed around Ranger weeks earlier were buried beneath the cedar marker. No grand monument, no polished marble, only a simple wooden cross. And one carved inscription: Ranger, faithful partner. Final mission accomplished. When everyone else had gone home, Ethan remained alone beneath the stars. The water continued flowing through the valley. He looked toward the wooden marker beneath the tree. His voice barely rose above a whisper. You kept every promise. For the first time since Daniel Brooks had died, Ethan cried without shame, not because he had lost another partner, but because he had been blessed enough to have one worth grieving. The stars remained overhead long after the last truck had disappeared down the ranch road. Ethan sat beneath the old pecan tree until dawn. The cedar marker stood only a few feet away, simple and quiet, exactly as Ranger would have wanted. Beyond it, the well continued to flow. Steady, patient, unstoppable. The same sound that had carried hope back into the valley now became something even more personal. It sounded like a promise being kept. As the first light spread across the hills, Ethan slowly stood. His knees protested. His shoulders ached. The scars on his body reminded him that time never stopped moving. Still, he smiled. For the first morning in many years, he wasn't asking himself what came next. He already knew. He walked to the edge of the well and filled a small metal canteen. Then he carried it back beneath the pecan tree. He poured a little water onto the roots. Your last gift, he whispered. For both of us. Spring arrived earlier than anyone expected. The restored groundwater system transformed the valley one field at a time. Abandoned windmills turned once more. Creeks that had been dry for years began carrying narrow ribbons of clear water. Native grasses returned across hillsides that had been nothing but dust. Birdsong filled mornings that had once begun in silence. Families who had left the valley returned. Children rode bicycles along roads where moving trucks had once carried away everything their parents owned. Old ranch houses echoed with laughter again. Even businesses in the nearby town reopened. The diner extended its hours. The hardware store hired new employees. A feed supply warehouse that had been locked for nearly 4 years welcomed customers again. People called it an economic recovery. Ethan called it something much simpler. Neighbors helping neighbors. The Valley Groundwater Restoration Fund officially opened that summer. Exactly as Ethan had requested, every payment connected to the archaeological discovery was directed into restoring wells, repairing irrigation systems, preserving ranch land, and funding water research. The Golden Bull never belonged to one person. It became the centerpiece of a new educational museum built several miles from the excavation site. Visitors traveled from across the country to see it. But before entering the main exhibit, they encountered something unexpected. Not the statue, not ancient tools, not maps. The very first display featured a life-sized photograph of an aging German shepherd standing beneath a weathered pecan tree. Below the photograph rested Ranger's worn leather collar. Beside it was a small bronze plaque. It read, "History remembers discoveries. Character remembers those who refuse to stop searching." Thousands of visitors paused there longer than they did before the Golden Bull. School children often asked the same question. Was Ranger really the one who found the place? The museum guides always answered the same way. He found much more than that. Years passed. The ranch changed with every season. Ethan rebuilt the old bunkhouse instead of replacing it. He repaired the porch where he and Ranger had watched so many sunrises. He restored Daniel Brooks's weathered barn one beam at a time. Neighbors helped without being asked. Luis insisted on replacing the fencing. Margaret organized volunteers to preserve every historical record connected to the underground chamber. Captain Wade Collins brought firefighters every spring to help maintain the trails around the protected archaeological site. The valley had become more than a collection of ranches. It had become a community again. Victor Langford eventually sold most of the land his company had purchased. With groundwater restored and the valley thriving, speculation no longer offered the opportunity it once had. One afternoon, years later, he quietly visited the museum without any reporters present. He walked alone through the exhibits. He studied the ancient engineering maps. He stood silently before the Golden Bull. Finally, he stopped in front of Ranger's photograph. For several long moments, he said nothing. Then he removed his business card from his wallet. The same design that had once carried the words Langford Development Group. He looked at it, folded it in half, then again, before placing it into a nearby recycling bin. Without speaking to anyone, he walked back outside. Some victories never appeared in headlines. Some changes happened quietly, like water shaping stone, like regret teaching wisdom. One autumn evening, nearly 5 years after the discovery, Ethan climbed the small hill overlooking the ranch. The valley below glowed beneath the golden light of sunset. Healthy cattle grazed across green pastures. Children laughed near irrigation ponds. Farm trucks rolled along roads that no longer ended at abandoned homes. The pecan tree still stood proudly beside the well. Its branches stretched wider than before. Its leaves whispered softly in the breeze. At its base rested the simple cedar marker. Time had weathered the wood, but the carved words remained clear. Faithful partner. Final mission accomplished. Ethan carried 2 cups of coffee. He placed one beside the marker, just as he had done every Sunday morning since Ranger's passing. Then he sat quietly in the grass. "I wish you could see it now," he said. The wind moved gently through the leaves. Water flowed steadily nearby. He smiled. "You probably already do." As dusk settled across the valley, headlights appeared along the distant road. Several pickup trucks approached the ranch. Neighbors, friends, veterans, children carrying fishing poles, families bringing homemade pies. No invitations had been sent. None were necessary anymore. The ranch had become the place where people gathered, where stories were shared, where newcomers learned why the valley had survived. As everyone settled beneath the old pecan tree, one little boy looked at the wooden marker and tugged on his grandfather's sleeve. Who was Ranger? The old veteran smiled before answering. He was the kind of friend who stayed. The boy looked toward the flowing well. Did he save everybody? The old man glanced toward Ethan, then back at the child. He helped one man keep a promise. He paused. And because of that, he looked across the green valley stretching beneath the evening sky. He helped save all of this. No one spoke for a while. They simply listened, to children laughing, to neighbors talking, to wind moving through the branches, and to the steady sound of water flowing across a valley that had nearly been forgotten. The golden bull remained safely preserved beneath careful hands. The ancient builder's work had finally been completed. Daniel Brooks's promise had been honored. Eleanor's ranch had lived. The valley had found hope again. And though Ranger was no longer walking beside Ethan, his greatest lesson remained. True treasure is never measured by what we keep. It is measured by what we leave behind so others can live. As darkness gently settled over the Texas hills, Ethan looked once more toward the old pecan tree. Then he quietly followed the laughter back toward home. The sound of flowing water followed him all the way. If you believe loyalty and keeping your word still matter, comment 1. If you'd have made the same choice Ethan did, type yes and tell us where you're watching from. And if stories about justice, dignity, and ordinary Americans standing their ground mean something to you, subscribe and join us for the next journey.